And we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery with our live virtual studio audience. And we are ready to dive straight in and start Masechet Middot. It's a brand new Masechta, a brand new tractate that we are starting tonight. Very exciting. It's only 5 chapters long, and it talks about the various measurements of the Beit HaMikdash, the various measurements of the temple. So we're going to get the words for you up on the screen over here. Everyone can see that, I hope. Fantastic. And I can see you, and you can see me. So here we go with the first Mishnah of chapter 1, Mishnah 1. So we're going to talk about the details of the process in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, which includes the Shmirah, which includes the guarding of the Beit HaMikdash. And it starts, for those of you who paid enough attention to Masechet Tamid, it starts in the same way as Masechet Tamid. We saw that there were 24 places in the Beis HaMikdash that had watchmen, that had guards. 3 of those places, 3 of those stations were guarded by Kohanim. And then the Leviim would guard the additional 21 areas. Okay, so that is where we're going to be starting. Now, hopefully you guys can get the picture of the Beit HaMikdash up on your phones or up on your computers, and I'll try and be as descriptive as I possibly can as we go along. I just don't know if it's going to be so helpful for me to also get it up on the screen as well. Is that it? That is it. Let's put it. Okay, so occasionally I'll try and describe on the map as well where it's up to. But let's give it a go and see how we get on, shall we? So here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. B'shlosha makomos hakohanim shomrim b'beis hamikdash. There were 3 places that the Kohanim guarded and protected in the Beis HaMikdash. So we can experiment and we can get it up on the screen here. I don't know if anyone will be able to see it. Maybe if we make it a bit bigger on the screen like that. So the first place in the Beis HaMikdash is called Beit Avtinas. You know what? We're not going to use it. The first one is Beit Avtinas. Where was Beit Avtinas? Beit Avtinas is, points if you find Beit Avtinas, it is on the right, well, points if you get it. No, it's at the top there. At the top of your diagrams, around the middle, there's a chamber there called Beit Avtinas, right at the top, on the right, kind of halfway along, but more towards the right. That's where Beit Avtinas was. So that was one area where the Kohanim would guard the Beis HaMikdash from. Uva Beis HaNitzutz. One of them was called the Beis HaNitzutz, called the Chamber of the Spark, and the Beis HaNitzutz is somewhere else, down the bottom right of the diagram over there. And then the third place is called the Beis HaMoked, the fire chamber. Where was the Beis HaMoked? Somewhere else. Can't find it easily on the diagram, but there you go. So there are 3 places where the Kohanim would guard the Beis HaMikdash from. Says the Mishnah, the Leviim stood guard in 21 places. Chamisha al Chamisha Sharei Har Habayit. They stood at the 5 gates of the Beis HaMikdash, of the Temple Mount. Arba'a al Arba Pino Sav Mitocha. They had 4 stations on the inside of the wall, on 4 corners on the inside. Chamisha al Chamisha Sharei HaZarah. They had 5 at the gates of the Azara, the gates of the courtyard. And Arba al Arba Pinoteha Mibachutz. And they had 4 that were on the outer corners, on the outside. They were on the outer edge, so they weren't allowed inside the Azara, but they would be on the outer edge to be able to guard as Leviim. The Echad b'lishkas hakorban. One of them stood guard at the lishkas hakorban. They had Kohen who was guarding from the inside, but they would be guarding from the outside. The lishkas hakorban is I can't find that one either. Rubbish, Rabbi Nick. Where would that one be? Okay, well, you know it's there. It's the base of Mikdash, for crying out loud. But that's where they'd be standing as well. Fine. Ve'echad b'lishkas ha'paroches, one at the chamber of the curtain, which is where they made the paroches. And great news, it's not even clear exactly where that one was. So at least I'm not failing on all counts. Ve'echad la'achore beis ha'kaparos, and one of them was behind the place of the kaparos. So that is where they had their 21 Levite guards who would guard the base Hamikdash. Mishnah base. While they were guarding at night, there was a supervisor who inspected all of the mishmarot, who inspected all of the guard positions. So says the Mishnah, Ish har habayis hayamachazer kol mishmar. There was a guy who would go around and circulate around all of the different guarding posts. Va'avukos dolkin lefanav, and there were torches lit before him. The kol mishmar she'ena omed, and any guard that didn't rise, presumably because they would be asleep, let's say, or they were distracted. So any guard that didn't stand up when they heard his footsteps, Omer lo ish har habayis, he would say to them, "You, sir, officer of the temple, shalom alecha, shalom to you. Nikar shehu yashen." If it was obvious that he was asleep, chavta b'makla, then he would strike him with his stick. This is amazing. He had permission to start to singe their clothing, right? To really get them to freak out and wake up. You know, imagine being asleep and you start going. Right, so it was a serious business. They had to stand guard in the base of Mikdash. You can't just fall asleep in the holiest place, in the holiest city, in the holiest country in the world. So you had to be awake. So if they were asleep, he had permission to start burning their clothing while they were wearing them and freak them out. Presumably then nobody ever fell asleep. It's a good incentive to not allow it to happen. V'heim omrim makol ba'azara. And the others would say, what's all that noise going on over there? Kol ben Levi loket uvegadav nisrafin sheyashen lo al mishmaro. And they would know that it was the cry, the shouting of a Ben Levi, of a Levite, who was being beaten up and burnt for falling asleep on the job. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov omer pam achas matzu es achi ima yashen v'sarfes kisusa. One time, says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, my uncle was asleep and they burnt his clothes. So don't fall asleep, guys, when you're on the job, says the Mishnah. Here we go. Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Gimel. So we're going to be talking now about the different gates and different things all around the base of Mikdash. So we're going to be working from the bottom of the Temple Mount and upwards. So the south side, which on our diagrams is the top of the diagram, that was the most open side to the Beis Hamikdash. So the Mishnah says, Chamisha sha'arim hayu laharabais. There were 5 gates to get onto the Temple Mount. Now, what's interesting is that our diagram doesn't necessarily feature the Temple Mount. This is kind of the diagram of the temple compound, and there was still like a huge expanse of courtyard space, which was really the rest of Har Habayit. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go onto Google and look up diagrams of the Beis Hamikdash. One of these days, if I'd have been sensible, I would have gone all out and prepared a whole techno wizardry, 3D fantastic tour to take you on while we were learning it. That would have certainly brought it to life. Anyway, I'm not that smart. So 5 gates that would bring people onto Har Habayis. Shnei Sharei Chulda min Hadaram. From the south side, you had the 2 Chulda gates. Meshamshin Kanisa Vitzia. One of them was used as an entrance. One of them was used as an exit. There was a specific procedure for how people would walk and navigate around the Beis Hamikdash. So Shar Chulda, which is named after the prophetess Chulda, who would sit in that area and prophesy. So those gates are named after her. Kifonos min Hamarav. There was a gate called Kifonos, which was named after the person who donated it. he had a gate on the west side. Mishamesh Kanisa Vitzia. On our diagram, that would be on the right side of the Beis Hamikdash. And there was also an entrance and an exit. Tadi Minat Safon. There was a gate there called the Tadi Gate, and that was on the north side. Lo Hayam Mishamesh Klum. That was not used at all. Shar HaMizrachi, the eastern gate, Alav Shushan Abirat Surah, over which there was a diagram or a representation, it says there, of the palace of Shushan, Shebo Kohen Gadol HaSoref Es Apara, and through which the Kohen Gadol would burn the red heifer, V'chol Misadeha Yotzin Lahar Mishcha, and all who were helping out with it would go out to the Mount of Olives. So they would go out of the eastern entrance to be able to go out to the Har Zaitim, to the Mount of Olives. Now, let's just try and picture this for a second over here, guys. The western wall, right, which we can picture, and if we were to picture the western wall, therefore, it's like the top of our diagram. So, for all intents and purposes, you would turn your diagram portrait, yeah? And this top area here would be what we would see if we were looking at the western wall. So this end of the Beis Hamikdash would be the nearest end to the western wall. And then you'd have the whole expanse of Har Habayis working its way from out of that direction. So it's quite fascinating. It's quite interesting. So that is Mishnah Gimel. Let's move on to Mishnah Daled. So says the Mishnah in Mishnah Daled, right? We'd said that there were 5 gates to the Azara. Now we're actually going to reference 7, and there are some opinions that there were 13. So it really does get quite confusing. But here is the gates to the Azara, the gates leading into our diagram over here. Chamisha Sharim Hayu L'Harabai. So the 5 gates to the temple. I'm in the wrong one. Sorry. Shiva Sharim Hayu Ba'Azara. There were 7 gates to the Azara, to the courtyard. As I said, some said there were 13, but let's go with 7. Shlosha B'Tzafon. There were 3 on the north, which is the bottom of our diagram. Ushlosha B'Darom. 3 on the south, which is the top of our diagram. Ve'echad B'Mizrach. 1 on the left. And then it's going to name them for us. Shebadarom on the south side, which is our top of our diagram. So working from right to left, I think. Shar HaDelek, which on our diagram is the second to the right. That is the fuel gate. That's where they brought fuel for the Mizbeach. Sheni Lo Shar HaBacharos, the one along to the left of that is the Shar HaBacharos, of the firstborn animals. Shlishi Lo Shar HaMayim, and the third one is the water gate, which is where they would bring water for Nisach HaMayim on Sukkot. Sheba Mizrach, on the east wall, which working anti-clockwise, would be Shar Nicanor. So that there would be the Nicanor gate. That's actually in the middle of our diagram by the semicircle steps over there. Ushtei L'Shachos Hayulah, and that had 2 chambers either side of this gate. Achat Mimino v'achat Mismolah. 1 to the right and 1 to the left. The Nicanor gate was named after the individual who donated these enormous golden gates. And there's actually a fantastic story that's told about them, that they were too heavy for the ship and they got thrown into the water and they miraculously washed up ashore with the ship that was bringing them over from overseas. And then they were brought to the Beis Hamikdash, but they were donated and paid for by this guy Nicanor. So there were 2 chambers, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. Achas Lishchas Pinchas HaMalbish, v'achas Lishchas Osei Chavatin. 1 was the chamber of Pinchas the dresser, and 1 was the chamber of the people who made the fire pans, where they used to bake the offerings for the Kohen Gadol. That was the chamber where that was done. Mishnah Hey, V'Shebat Safon, in the northern side of the Beis Hamikdash, which in our diagram is at the bottom, says the Mishnah Shar HaNitzotz, is this gate of nitzotz, of sparks, which is the bottom right of our diagram. It was a 2-layer porch. It had a whole structure to it. Uchmin achsadra haya, and it was shaped like a portico, as it says there. It had a porch. Ve'aliyah benuya al gabav, and there was an upper chamber which was built on top of it. Shakonim shomrim milmalan, where the Kohanim would watch out from the top, the upper level. The Halavim milamatan, and the Leviim would watch from the lower level. Pesach hayolochel, and there was an entrance that went into the chel, into the inner compound, or the outer compound. No, the chel is a structure, 10 amot structure outside the Azara, on top of Har Habayit, between Har Habayit and the fence and the wall of the Azara. So that's where it opened onto. Says the Mishnah, Sheni lo Shar HaKorban. There was also, next to that on the left, the Shar HaKorban, the gate of sacrifice, Shlishi lo Beis HaMokad. And next to that is the Beis HaMokad, and that's why it wasn't labeled like that on my okay, so that's the fire chamber. So that's 2 entrances to the Azara and outside the Beis HaMikdash. That's why I've written in my notes, doesn't really parallel the picture in the diagram, so that's why we can't quite put our finger on it. But that's where these gates were. Sometimes I can help, sometimes I am useless, but all the time I try my best. Mishnah Vav, elaboration of a Mishnah in Maseches Tamid. So, va'arba lashachos hay bebeis hamokad. This area of the Beis Hamokad had 4 chambers. So, back in our diagram, we're in the bottom of the diagram, and there's a chamber there called Beis Hamokad, which is broken up into 4 rooms. Okay, and that was called the fire chamber, and that was basically where the Kohanim, it was like the dressing room almost for the Kohanim. We talked about their dressing room a little bit. This is where they went to. So half of the chamber, if you can see, there's kind of 8 black dots in that diagram. So that kind of demarcates for us what was considered the inside of the Beis HaMikdash and what was considered the outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Mishnah says as follows: Kekitonos pasuchos letraklin. The 4 chambers were like sleeping chambers that opened up into a hall. Shtayim bakodesh, the upper 2 in our diagram, were considered in holy space. Ushtayim bachol, and 2 were considered to be outside of the holiness of the Beis HaMikdash. V'roshe pispasin mavdilim ben kodesh lachol, and they had a row of stones or of pillars that would separate between Kodesh and Chol. Umahayu mishamshas, and what were these different chambers used for? Ma'aravis deromis, the one that was top right, the top right chamber in there on our diagram. Hi salishkas tzlai korban. This was where they would store the sacrificial lambs. Deromis mizrachis, moving to the top left. The top left was hi salishkas osei lechem apanim. This is where they would, where they would make the lechem apanim, the showbread, the 12 loaves of bread that went onto the table, onto the shulchan. The next one is Mizrachis Saphonis. The bottom left one is Mizrachis Saphonis. That is the northeastern chamber. Bar ganzu v'nei chashmonai es avnei hamizbeach sheshiktu malchei Yavam. That is where they hid or deposited the stones of the altar, which was defiled by the Greek kingdom. It's also on our diagram. It's called the place of the seals, Chotamot, and this was where they could buy a kind of like a stamp to be able to get certain things in the Beis HaMikdash. But it was also where they hid the stones of the altar after they got defiled by the Greeks. And Saphonis Ma'aravis, and the final one in the bottom right of our diagram, by Yordim Leveis HaTfilah. This is where they would go down underneath the Beis HaMikdash to be able to go to the mikveh. So it's like a stairway that would lead down underneath the Beis HaMikdash, and that way they could go to a mikveh without having to be impure and walking through the compound of the Beis Hamikdash. Mishnah Zion. Here we go, guys. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Zion. Shnaim Sha'arim Hayu LeBeis HaMoked. There were two entrances to the Beis HaMoked, to this chamber that had four parts to it. Echad Patuach Lachel, the Echad Patuach Lazara. One had an entrance that would take you out to the Chel, which is the kind of outer compound of Har Habayis, and one would bring you into the Azara, into the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Zeha Shahaya Patuach Lazara, Pishpash Katan Hayalo, Shebo Nichnasin Livloshes Azara. Says Rabbi Yehuda that the one that entered into the Beis Hamikdash, one into the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, had a small opening, and through that small opening is where they would go through to be able to inspect the kalim, inspect the vessels, and search the courtyard. So if you can imagine like a big door that would go into the Beis Hamikdash, within that big door, I guess, there would have been a smaller door that they could open as well. Mishnah Ches, Beis Hamoked, Kippah. The Beis Hamoked had a dome on the top of its roof. Ubayis Gadol Haya, and it was a large room. Mukaf Rovdin Shel Even, and it had big stone benches, kind of like, imagine like a stone amphitheater. It had leveled rows of stones. V'ziknei Beis Avi Shenim Sham, and this is where the Kohanim would go to sleep when they were serving that week, that shift in the Beis Hamikdash. U'maftachos hazar bi'adam, and the keys of the temple would be in their hands. U'firchei kahuna ish kisaso ba'aretz, and the younger Kohanim, they would just kind of place their bedding on the floor and they would sleep there. So the elders would have these not exactly comfortable stone benches, stone projections to be able to sleep on, and the younger ones would all sleep on the floor. Mishnah Tes, our final Mishnah for the first chapter this evening. Says the Mishnah, Umakom hayasham ama al ama, and there was a place there which was one ama by one ama, the tavla shel shayish, and it was a table for all intents. It was a slab of marble. The tabas haisa kavuaba, and there was a ring that was fixed to this this slab of marble, which was one ama by one ama. The shalsheles shamaftachos hayu tzulusba, and there was a chain. The keys to the Beis Hamikdash would be chained to this slab. Higiyazman and Ne'ilah, when it would come to lock up the gates at the end of the day, that's why Ne'ilah is called Ne'ilah. It was the time of day, at the end of the day, when they would lock the gates of the Beis Hamikdash. Higbia es hatavla b'tabas v'natal es hamaftachos min hashalsheles. They would lift the slab by the ring, and they would take the keys to be able to go and lock the doors. V'nala kohen mibifnim, and when it would come to lock the Beis Hamoked, they would lock it from within. Uven Levi yashen lo b'machutz, and the Leviim would be on the outside. They'd be sleeping on the outside. Gamar milin o, when he'd finished locking up, hechazeres hamaftachos l'shalsheles ve'es hatavla limkama. Then he would put the keys back, chain them up to this slab, put everything back in its place. Nasan kasuso aleha and yashen lo, and he would put his garment, he would put his pillow, whatever, and that's where he would sleep. So he would be guarding these keys while he was sleeping. Era keri be'echad mahem, if one of these kohanim who were sleeping in this chamber would have a nocturnal emission which would make them tamei, yotzei v'holech lo b'mesiba ha'holeches tachas habira. So they would take that entrance, they would go through that door that would take them underneath the bira, which would take them underneath the Beis Hamikdash. V'aneiros dolkim mikana mikana, and there would be candles lit either side in this tunnel, in this tunnel that goes underneath the Beis Hamikdash. Ad shehu magia leBeis HaTefillah, until he would reach the Beis HaTefillah, the mikveh, which in our diagram is at the top of the diagram. So you kind of, if you can see above, directly on top of the Mizbeach on our diagram, on top of the altar, it says Mikveh Avur Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippur. There was a mikveh which the Kohen Gadol would use first thing in the morning on Yom Kippur. That was also the mikveh that they would use if they had a nocturnal emission and had to go and purify themselves. They would go underneath the Beis HaMikdash to be able to reach that point. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, b'mesiba ha'holeches tachas hachel yotzei v'holech lo b'tadi, that he would go by the winding stair which went under the chel, and then he would go out by the Tadi gate. So I think what it's saying here is that he didn't actually come back after he purified himself. There was another secret exit, and that secret exit, that secret passage, would take him out on the north side and take him out of the Beis HaMikdash. He wouldn't come back to work. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Mazdov, everybody, on completing chapter 1 of Masechet Middot, and we are going to jump into chapter 2, Mishnah Aleph, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. So we're going to be talking now about the dimensions, about the measurements of Har Habayis, and we're going to talk about how people moved around. So the Mishnah says, Har Habayis, Haya Chamesh Meos Ama, Al Chamesh Meos Ama. The Har Habayis was 500 amot squared. That's how big the campus of Har Habayis was, of which our diagram is going to be a part of that 500 by 500. So this diagram is not 500 by 500. The temple compound, Har Habayis, is 500 by 500 amot squared. Ruba min hadarom. And most of the open space was on the south side. So in our diagram, the top of our diagram and upwards, that's where most of the space was. We can kind of picture that. If we're standing at the western wall, then everything off to our right, would be where the bulk of the space was on Har Habayis, and then the Beis HaMikdash, as it were, kind of stood slightly off to the left of what we can see when we're looking at the Beis HaMikdash, basically where at the Kotel, basically where the Golden Dome is. So everything to that right, that would be the most the larger space. So says the Mishnah. So most of the open space would be on the south side. Sheni lo min mizrach. Then the eastern side would be the second largest expanse. Shlishi lo min tzafon. The northernmost expanse would be to the north. And mi'uto min ma'arav. And the smallest open space would be on the western side, closest to the western wall. Makom shahaya rav midatzo, sham haya rav tashmisha. And the parts which were biggest would see most of the action. That's why most of the gates were on those sides. Says the Mishnah and Mishnah Beis, whenever you would come onto Har Habayis, you would want to be heading for the east side. So let me just scroll down to the English for you over there. So you would want to be kind of turning right to be able to do a, I guess, anti-clockwise an anti-clockwise route around, I think. Let's have a look. Kol hanichnasin lahar habayis, nichnasin derech yamin. Anyone who would come onto the Temple Mount would enter on the right-hand side, umakifin viyotzin derech small, and they would go around anti-clockwise and would come out on the exit gate on the left-hand side. Chutz memi she'aro davar shehu makif l'small, except for someone for whom or to whom something had happened. So, for example, a mourner would go in the opposite direction. And the reason for that is that people who would see someone going in the wrong direction would assume that there was a reason for it, and then they would reach out to that person and speak to them. So the Mishnah says, "Ma lacha makif l'smol." They would see someone coming on the wrong way against the oncoming traffic, and they would say, what's happened to you? And he would answer, Shani Arvel, well, I'm actually in mourning. And so then the person would have an opportunity to say to him, Hashochem b'bayis hazeh yinachameka, that the one who dwells in this house should give you comfort. So because they're going in the opposite direction, they're forced to interact with each other. And there would be a good reason why they are interacting, and it gives the person an opportunity to comfort a mourner. Or they might say Shani Menudeh, or I've been excommunicated. That's another reason why someone might be walking in the opposite direction to everyone else. In which case, the person could say, Hashoichem b'bayis hazeh yitem b'libam v'karvucha. In which case, Divrei Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Meir, we would wish him that he should be inspired to change his ways so that Hashem can bring him near again. Amal Rabbi Yossi says, Asisan ki'ilu avru alav esadin. If you do that, you make it sound like he's being treated unfairly. Ella, rather, you would say, Hashoichem b'bayis hazeh yitem b'libacha v'sishma l'divrei chavirecha v'karvucha. Rather, what you would say is, may he who dwells in this house, i.e. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, inspire you to listen to the words of your colleagues so that they may draw you near again. So that would be the purpose for people walking in the opposite direction, to be able to encourage this kind of interaction, which is fascinating, really, because you never know what people are going through. And the Beis HaMikdash would almost force you to be able to confront how other people might be feeling, and so that you could be there for them at this time of great mourning, potentially. Mishnah Gimel. Once you got out of Har Habayis, you always had to walk around a surrounding gate. So the Mishnah says, Lifnim Mimenu, within it was the Soreg. And the Soreg was Gavoha Asar Tfachim. It was 10 Tfachim high. Ushloshesre Pratzot Hayusham. There were 13 piercings, there were 13 places where the Greeks had pierced this fence. There were 13 breaches, Shepratzum Malche Yavam, that the Greeks had breached. And Chazru Ugdarum, and they came and repaired them. The Gazru Kenegdam Shloshes Hishtachavayas, and they made a takana, they made a gezerah, they made a rule that any time you would walk past one of these 13 points along the fence, you would have to prostrate. You didn't have to prostrate at all 13. There would just be one that you were supposed to prostrate at, whichever one you came to first, perhaps. But the point was that you were supposed to take a moment to reflect and recognize where you were at that time. You were in a place where the Greeks had penetrated and breached our beloved Beis HaMikdash. Lifnim Imenu Hachel. So within that now, you're into the Chel. From this point and in, the Chel is, it's part of the compound essentially, and it's Eser Amot. It was 10 Amot broad, and from this point and onwards, no non-Jews would be allowed to go any further. So from the Chel and inwards, that's all now just for the Jews. So there's this 10 Amot place where that was the threshold, the limit to where the non-Jews were allowed to go to. And then Ushtem Esrei Ma'alot Hayusham. And then there would be 12 steps that would be taking you up even further. Rum Hama'ala Chatzi Amah. The height of each step was half an amma. The Shilcha Chatzi Amah. And then the flat surface, the tread, would be half an amma. So they're increasing in increments of half an amma. Chutz mishel ulam, except for the ulam where the steps were larger, says the Mishnah. Kol ha'psachim v'hasharim shayusham, all of the gateways and the entrances in the Beis HaMikdash, gavhan esrim amah, they were 20 amas high. V'rachban eser amas, and they were 10 amas wide. Chutz mishel ulam, except for the entranceway to the ulam, because that was unique. Kol ha'psachim sham shahayusham, all of the entranceways, all of the gates, hayu lahem doltot, they would have doors. Chutz mishel ulam, except for the ulam. Again, that was also unique as well. The ulam is the on our diagram. If you can see to the right of the mizbeach, which was where you'd be entering into the chamber that had the menorah and the golden altar and the kodesh hakadoshim and the table. Oh, they just triggered the alarm for the ark. Jacqueline? Gosh, never a dull moment in this shul. So, where were we? We were saying that all of the doors had latot, had doorways. Oh, except for the ulam. So the ulam is kind of the entrance chamber before you reach the menorah and before you reach the Kodesh HaKodashim. So that's the line running top to bottom in our diagram. That's the ulam. It's kind of like the entrance hall before you get into the heichal, which is the inner chamber of the Beis Hamikdash. I hope all that's clear on our diagrams. Okay, so kol hasha'arim shahayu sham, all of the gates that were there, hayu lahen shkafot, they would all have shkafot, which the Mishnah, which the screen here translates as lintels. Chutz me'shar tadi, except for the tadi gate. Shahayu sham shtei avanim mutot zohar gav zohar, except for the gate of tadi, which had two stones inclined on one another. They have like a V-shaped stone lintel door frame. I guess you could call it that. Kol hasharim shahayu sham nishtanu liyos shel zahav. All of the gates in the Beis Hamikdash were made out of gold, or at least covered with gold. Chutz mishar Nikanor, except for the gate of Nikanor, mipnei shenasa bahen nes, because a miracle happened with the Nikanor gate. And as I said, they were actually made of brass or copper, and a miracle happened to them that when they were thrown overboard, they washed up ashore, and as a result of that, they didn't cover them with gold. They kept them as it was. And some say it wasn't that they wanted to mark the fact that this miracle had happened, and therefore they didn't cover it. But actually, some say that the copper glistened more than gold, and so they didn't require any additional covering because they were already beautiful enough the way that they had been designed, and perhaps on account of the miracle that had happened to them. Mishnah Daled, Kol HaKasalim Shahayu Sham. So when they built the walls and the gates, there was still wall on top of the opening of the gate. I hope that makes sense. So the gates were recessed into the walls. There was still wall space on top of that. Kol HaKasalim Shahayu Sham Hayu Gavohim Chutz Mikotel HaMizrachi. All of the walls that were there were high, except for the eastern wall, right? And the reason for this is the eastern wall, the Kohen needed to be able to see through to the Holy of Holies when he was sprinkling the blood of the red heifer on Har Hazeisim, on the Mount of Olives. And so by standing in that place, he would be able to see right through to the Har Habayis, because everything would just be much more open and much more spacious. So the Kohen who was burning the red heifer would be standing on the top of the Mount of Olives, and he would be looking carefully to be able to see the opening of the sanctuary, the opening of the Heichal, while he was sprinkling the blood. So the height of the gateway was 20 amos. From the bottom of Har Habayis to the Heichal, there would be 22 amos, right? And so if there was a wall above the gate, he wouldn't be able to see all the way through. So Shara Mizrach was opened right up so that he would be able to see right through to the Heichal. It's great to picture this in your head. And I don't know if you've seen, but online there are different 3D videos that you can see online of what the Beit HaMikdash would look like. And when you start to have some of that in your mind and see some of that, all of this really does come to life. I'll try and send out some links if I can. Mishnah Hey, Ezras Hanashim haisa orech 135 al rochav 135. So we're back on our diagrams now. On the left-hand side of our diagram, basically that whole left square of the diagram is the Ezrat Nashim, the courtyard of the women. And that was 135 amot long by 135 amot wide. So it was a large square with 4 rooms in its corners, and each room was 40 by 40 amot. It didn't have a roof, this chamber. This Azara says the Mishnah. There were 4 chambers in 4 corners. Shel arba'im va'arba'im amma. That were each 40 by 40 amot squared. And they were not roofed. And not only that, but they would also not be roofed in the time to come when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt. Shne'emar vayatzienu el hechatzer chitzona vayavirenu el abas miktsoi hechatzer v'nei chatzer b'miktsoi hechatzer chatzer b'miktsoi hechatzer ba'abam. Okay, a lot of reading here, but I'll come to the English. Ba'abam miktsaros hechatzer chatzer is keturas. Says the pasuk. Then he brought me forth into the outer court and caused me to pass by the 4 corners of the court, and behold, in every corner of the court there was a court. Right, there were these chambers. In the 4 corners of the court there were keturot courts. So what are these keturot? What does that mean? Ve'en keturot ela she'enon mikorot. Keturot means that they were not roofed. Umahayu mishamshas. And what were they used for? Dromis mizrachis. So starting on the top left chamber, this was the Nazarite chamber, and this is where the korban shlamim would be taken to in order to cook them up, and also to be able to cut the hair of the Nazarites, which would be used as fuel. So this is what's going on in the lishchas hanazirim. Shisham hanazirim evashlim eshalmeim. This is where the Nazarites would cook up their peace offerings. Umagalchin esaran is where they would shave off their hair. Umashalchin tachas hadud, and it's where they would feed that hair to be able to fuel the fire. Okay, and then throw it under the pot. Then we come to the Mizrachis Saphonis. Now we're on the northeastern chamber, which is the bottom left chamber. So working anti-clockwise around the diagram. This is the chamber of wood. Shishama kohanim bale mumim maslin ha'etzim. This is where those who were blemished, kohanim, they would be able to go to this chamber and check the wood. This is where they would inspect it for any worms. And any piece of wood which would be found to be infested with worms, pasul me'al gabei hamizbeach. They would be disqualified from using that wood on the mizbeach. So because these kohanim are not going to be able to necessarily do other work in the Beis Hamikdash, they at least can do something. Saphonis Maravis, the bottom right chamber in the northwest. This is where the people with Soraas would prepare themselves on the 8th day. They had to go to the Azara. They had to have blood sprinkled on their toes, on their thumbs, and on their ears. So says the Mishnah that it's the place, the chamber of the Mitzoraim. It seems there was a mikveh there as well. If you can have a look on your diagram, there was a mikveh for them as well. Says the Mishnah, Maravis Deromis, the southwestern corner, the top right. Ama Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Shachachti mehaisa mishameshes. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says he couldn't remember what it was used for. Continues the Mishnah. Abba Shaul Omer, Sham ha'yunosnin yain v'shemen. This is where they would store wine and oil. He ha'san nikreis lishkas beis shmanya, and it was called therefore lishkas beis shmanya, the chamber of the oil. Says the Mishnah, v'chalaka ha'isa barishona. Says the courtyard was originally smooth. It was originally surrounded just by walls. Vekifuha kasotzra. But eventually, as time went on, they built a balcony around the Azara. Shanashim ro'ots milmalam. This is where the women would go and stand. They built a ladies' gallery in the Ezrat Nashim. and that was where the women would go and stand. Nashim il matan, and the men would stand at the bottom. Kadei shelo yehuma oravim, so that they wouldn't get mixing together too much. So if there were a lot of people, and if you picture things like the Simchas Beis HaShoeva during Sukkot, where there would be tons of people coming to the Beis HaMikdash and filling up that whole Azara, so they didn't want the men and the women having to mingle too closely, so they erected a ladies' gallery for the women to be able to stand in. And in this chamber, you get to the 15 steps that would lead up to where the next courtyard would be, the Ezras Yisrael, which corresponded to the 15 chapters of Tehillim that start with the words Shir Hamalos, the song of ascent, the song of the steps that take you up. Shalein HaLevim Omrim Bashir, which is where the Levim would stand and they would sing to the people. Lo hayu trutot elo mukafos kechat zigorin agula. So these steps were not rectangular, but they were circular, like half of a threshing floor. So that's why in our diagram, these steps are semicircular. So they weren't just straight, rigid steps. It was beautifully done in a semicircular shape. And that was how they built the steps to the Ezras Yisrael. Mishnah Vav. Ulashachos hayu sachas Ezras Yisrael. And they had chambers underneath the Ezrat Yisrael. So built into the recesses of the wall that would form on either side of the circular steps, you would have some more storage cupboards, as it were. The doorways were on the side of the Ezrat Nashim, our big square on the left. Shisham alavim nosnim kinoros and nevalim and mitzoltai mechol klei shir. These were storage areas for the Levium to keep their lyres and their lutes and their cymbals and all of their musical instruments. Says the Mishnah, Ezras Yisrael haisa orech mea ama ushloshim v'chamesh al rochav achas esrei. So as you would go through the doors into the Ezras Yisrael, just before you would reach the Mizbeach, you had a strip which ran 135 amos across, but only 11 amos, about what would that be? Several feet, however many feet, just a few feet into the base of Middot. It was a strip of space, and that was for people who weren't doing avoda, but they could stand there and they could watch on. So, v'chein Ezras Kohanim haisa orech 135 al rochav achas esrei. And similarly, the court of the priests was 135 cubits in length by 11 in breadth. The Roshei Pispasin Mavdilim bein Ezras Yisrael and Ezras Kohanim, and there was a row of, I guess, decorative pieces which would separate and distinguish between the Ezrat Yisrael and the Ezrat Kohanim. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Amer Ma'ala Haisasham. There was actually another step, an Amma high, and we actually hold by this as well. He is the definitive opinion in these Mishnayos. So there was another step that would take them up into the Ezrat Kohanim. Vaduchan nasun aleha, and this was a platform. There was a platform that was placed there. Uba shalosh malas shel chatzi chatzi amma, and there were 3 steps, each a half cubit in height. And in so doing, Nimseis Ezras HaKohanim Gavah Me Ezras Yisrael Shtei Amos Umechetza. So what you would find is that the courtyard of the Kohanim, where the avoda was being performed, would be 2.5 amot higher than everybody else. Kol ha'azara haisa orech 187 al rochav 135. So what you would find is that the courtyard was 187 cubits by 135. So halfway from our picture, as it were, and off to the right, to the most right part of our diagram, those were the dimensions, 187 by 135. Says the Mishnah, and there were 13 places, as we said, to be able to prostrate that went around this area. Abba Yossi ben Chanan Omer says, Abba Yossi ben Chanan says, Keneged Shloisha Asa Sha'arim, that it was corresponding to the 13 gates. So remember we said were there 7 gates, were there 13 gates. So Yossi ben Chanan is saying that there were 7 areas, piercings, places to prostrate, which corresponded to 13 gates. Says the Mishnah, Sha'arim deromiyim smuchim l'ma'arav, the southernmost gates that were on the western side. So we're in the top right of our descriptions of our diagram. Shar ha'elyon, the upper gate, so starting from right going to left. Shar ha'elyon, which was closest to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Shar ha'delek, which was our fuel gate. Shar ha'bechoros, which was our firstborns. Shar ha'mayim, the water gate. V'lama nikra shmo shar ha'mayim. Why was it called the water gate? Shabo machnis and sluchis shal mayim shal nisach b'chag. Because this is where they would bring the pitchers of water to be able to do the libations on Sukkos. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, uvo hamayim efakim. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says this is where the water would well up. Va'asidin lihiyos yotz in mitachas mipsan habayis. And in the future, it is going to be where the water comes from under the threshold of the temple. And corresponding to them in the north, beginning on the western side, are Shar Yechonya. So where are we now? Where's Shar Yechonya? Where am I? The northern side closest to the west. So I'm at the bottom. I can't see Yechonya on my diagram. Okay. I'll just have to take your word for it. Shar Yechonya, Shar HaKorban. So I guess Yechonya on my diagram here is Shar HaNitzutz. Then Shar HaKorban. Then Shar HaNashim, the gates for women. Shar HaShir, the gates of song. And the Mishnah asks, V'lama nikra shmo Shar Yechonya. Why was it called Shar Yechonya? Especially because in my diagram it's called Shar HaNitzutz. Shebo yatsa Yechonya b'galuso. That was where Yechonya was sent into captivity. He was led to exile from there. Can't remember who Yechonya was. Sheba Mizrach, on the eastern side, that's on our left, Shar Nikanor. You got Shar Nikanor, which is in the middle of a diagram. And you got those 2 pishpashim, the 2 doors, one on the right, one on the left. And the 2 gates on the western side did not have a name. So if you can see on the right hand side of our diagram, where you've got two gates there in the black line that goes around the perimeter of the diagram, those 2 gates did not have a name. That, my friends, brings us, if I'm not mistaken, to the end of Perek Beis, to the end of chapter 2. So Mazel Tov everybody on completing the first 2 chapters of Masechet Middot, and that's all we have time for. So join us next week as we continue with this beautiful Masechta, which I'm sure is giving people a lot of light-hearted relief from some of the really technical korbanot sacrifices that we've had to be dealing with. There's only 3 more chapters of Masechet Middot, and they're all pretty similar in the terms of kind of describing things in the Beis HaMikdash. So hopefully it's a bit of easy listening. And then we have 1 more Masechta after that, which only has 3 chapters in, which hopefully we'll be able to understand as well. And then we'll be finished with Seder Kodshim. So it's really exciting, guys. But for now, let me wish you all a wonderful and meaningful night, and see you all at Mariv in a few minutes' time. Thank you.